Today is August 30th, 2016. We're in Athens, Georgia. I'm Mary Ellen Brooks, and our guest today is Marianne Michaelis.
Hello, hello.
Nice to see you again, Marianne.
Lovely to see you, Mary Ellen.
Well, I've known you for a long time, but there's so much I don't know about you. So I thought we would get together and delve into your past and find out some more secrets from your past.
Well, we'll see what will be revealed.
So I understand that you grew up in Mobile, Alabama.
I did. I think I was the fifth generation. Have deep southern roots, Mobile and New Orleans on the maternal side.
Well, that is so interesting. What can you tell us about growing up?
Oh, it was a way slow southern town at that point. Mobile, I don't know how much progress has been made because people in Mobile say if the world comes to an end, they won't know it for 30 years in Mobile, which is a terrible joke, but I'm sure there's great progress. However, all I was interested in was moving to New York. I had been taken to New York City as an infant because my mother was a concert singer, and her mother, my maternal grandmother, was a concert pianist. And so they would go to New York once or twice a year for a month at a time, that's without my daddy, and stay so that my mother could study with a great teacher, study singing and opera coaching. And they'd take me always, and either take a nurse along or get one when they were there so that I could be entertained in Central Park. As a matter of fact, they stayed in an apartment hotel opposite the Dakota, which is famous because that's where John Lennon was shot. So that was where I felt I really grew up a lot there in that part of New York. And it became my home when I escaped Mobile in my late teens to go and pursue a career in New York as a singer and actress.
Well, that is so interesting. Tell us more about your career.
Well, I will say it was rather cut short. I had done a little television, a little off-Broadway, some concerts. I even sang in a prison because it was a church thing to do, and I'm not sure it was such a smart thing. I was very young, and there I was singing at a church service in the prisons. But I was fine. I escaped, obviously. But I had an audition at what was then MCA, which was the biggest agency for theater and movies, stage, everything at the time. And I had an appointment with a man named Eleanor Michaelis. And it was on a Wednesday afternoon. And I took along concert programs and background, headshot. And he got terribly interested in the concert programs. Little did I know that he was a classical music lover and also loved to sing himself. And after the appointment, I didn't sing that day, but he was going to a meeting and said to me, "Would you like to share a taxi?" And I, of course, said yes. And before I got out of that taxi, he had invited me for dinner on Friday night. And we had a great time Friday night, and he asked me out for Saturday night. And then Sunday night. So he was a very impetuous man because by Sunday he asked me to marry him. And I was sort of blown away. But 5.5 months later, I did marry him. And so that kept me in New York forever and ever.
What a whirlwind story.
Crazy, really crazy.
So music brought you to New York. Did you study with your grandmother and mother?
No, I was set up with a wonderful vocal coach named William Brady. He taught a lot of famous people, and he was a tiny little man who had a great duplex living room, and he sat high up at his piano, and everyone called him Maestro. And it was quite an experience. I loved every minute of it. But after I got married, Arnold wanted me next to his side. He was very possessive. Didn't want me to leave town, go on the road. He didn't even want me out on auditions. And it was a time when women said yes. I don't think if I could do it all over again, I would keep, saying yes. But I did. And instead of continuing my career, I got involved in his career, which sort of started off in different ways because in the beginning, he was president of a television production company, and that sort of didn't get anywhere. And so he, from there, went to Columbia Records, where he was a VP for A&R, which is Vice President of Artist and Repertoire, in the classical division. And that was a great time because we were involved with Leonard Bernstein and Bruno Walter, who was one of the great conductors of this world, a fine German conductor, but he conducted everywhere. And at Columbia, Dr. Walter was celebrating his 80th birthday, and they asked Arnold, who was used to interviewing people because he had had a program on WQXR, which was the classical music station there, and he interviewed different musicians. So Columbia asked Arnold to interview Dr. Walter, have a conversation with him and record it, and they did, and they put it out as an extra recording with a symphony, and it was very popular and a marvelous conversation. And that started Arnold on a new career of having conversations on record with individuals of renown, because the next one was Eleanor Roosevelt. And that was fabulous because when the interview was arranged, it was at Hyde Park, at her cottage, which she called, it was a cottage in Valkill Cottage, which was at Hyde Park.
Okay.
On a Sunday afternoon, we drove up to Hyde Park with an engineer to do the recording and a photographer. And Mrs. Roosevelt met us at the door, and we were invited for Sunday dinner. And she had roast beef, and I remember the roast beef because she carved. And she did say, "Please do not photograph me while I'm eating," which is very sensible because it's not attractive when someone photographs you and you're chewing. I know I wouldn't like it. It was a remarkable conversation, and I know it's here in the library in Athens, at the University Library.
It is, and they have all those digitized. Almost all of the interviews are digitized and available. I've looked at several of them myself, and I wondered what your role was in the various interviews.
Well, it depended. If it was photographed, or if it was done on film, I did the backgrounds and help in the production. And if it was just a two-shot, just two people, I sometimes turn the button off and on, basically. And one time he was recording the Theater Guild people, who were head of the Theater Guild, and we were up in Connecticut at their house. And it was a marvelous interview. And at the end, I was so captivated, I forgot to turn the recording button on. So I was embarrassed. And it was terrible, because the second time around, it didn't have the same exuberance. So,
of all the interviews you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, and of all the ones you participated in, which obviously you remembered down to the meal you had with Eleanor Roosevelt, so what is your best memory?
Well, we began traveling around the world, really, because we went to India, and he recorded Prime Minister Nehru. Another time, the president of Pakistan, Ayub Khan, and we were given the same trip or the same tour that he gave Jackie Onassis, or she was Jackie Kennedy at the time, and Lee Radziwill. It was very grand and fabulous, and I had my children and a nanny with me, and the nanny was Inez, and my baby was a baby, and we were in the very rural sections of Pakistan at times, and there were lizards on the wall, and Inez sat up all night because she was afraid the lizards were going to fall on baby Lisa. And I don't like lizards, I have to say. So I was grateful she was keeping the lizards off of her.
And how long did you stay in India or Pakistan?
India several weeks, and Pakistan as well, on a different year, actually. And we also went to Yugoslavia as guests of Tito. And the fascinating part about it was we had usually local camera crews. Sometimes he brought his own crew, but it was interesting to have the local people, because we got to see more of the insides of the country and the insides of the houses and state departments and everything else. And especially when we went to the Soviet Union, he was back and forth over a year's time, so that it was a Russian crew. And that was time of still the Soviet Union, and the major domo of the trip for Arnold was a KGB person, but she was very, very pro America, because she lived in London and her English was perfect, and her feelings toward democracy were very warm. But to have a meeting with her to discuss what was going on, we'd go into the park in front of the National Hotel, because not only was the car that we rented bugged, but the hotel rooms were as well. So that was amazing, because we were there for 3 months. And by the time I got home, I was still sort of looking over my shoulder and thinking I was being followed or being listened to. And actually we were, because Arnold was told that the CIA tapped our phone for a while, because he had many phone conversations with his crew back in the Soviet Union, and they were interested in one of them as far as what was going on. So it really was not just something I was feeling, it was for real.
So there's a lot of intrigue in
Yeah,
some of
it
those
was.
trips.
I loved every minute of it.
Well, we wonder, when we look at the collection that we have here at the university, and you see all the scripts and the editing that went on, were you involved in any of that part of the
Well,
interview?
I didn't actually do the physical editing, but yes, I was involved in the production and research and discussions and meetings, etc.
It sounds like it would have been quite an effort to get into some of these countries at that time.
Well, it was, the Russian trip was through Senator Benton, who was head of the University of Chicago and also involved with Encyclopedia Britannica. And we did 5 films, and they were for Britannica films. So that's really, there we were in places where no Americans had been. And I was only there for 3 months at the time. And during that time, we really went all over, from Moscow down to Georgia, to Tbilisi, out to Siberia, to the Sea of Japan, to Novosibirsk and Khabarovsk. And actually, I got sick in Khabarovsk. And it was no fun going to the hospitals there, because there was like something out of the 17th century, really. The floors were sort of linoleum that was broken and blood-stained, and they took me into an examining room where there were just bare light bulbs swinging by a cord, and they decided that perhaps I had stomach problems. And they gave, this is terrible, but it's so fascinating and gruesome, I have to tell you. They gave me an enema. That was not what was wrong with me. So they said, well, you have to go to the women's hospital. So I get into this makeshift ambulance, which was nothing but an old station wagon with curtains. And they take me to another hospital, and there are people sort of just lying on the floors, ailing. It was unbelievable. And as sick as I was, I'm sort of glad now that I got sick, because I would have never experienced these horrors, really. And so I get to the women's hospital, and they decided I needed a pelvic exam. I had such high fever. I wasn't, I was just being taken along. The entire crew came in and watched. It was just unreal. Well, there was nothing wrong in that area. What was wrong was an amoebic problem in my system. So they decided they would pump my stomach. And at that point, I knew they were bringing water from the river, and I would probably die there. So I said, you've got to get me out of here. I'm just not going to last if you don't get me out of this city. So we flew back to Moscow, and they took me to the American Embassy doctor, and I said, what do you do with sick people like me? He said, we get them out of the country. We get them to Germany or send them home. So it was something.
That was an amazing story.
But I was well enough. I mean, he fixed me up so that I was well enough once back in Moscow to continue the trip.
Unbelievable. So have you kept a journal or a diary?
I wish I'd kept more detailed. I did keep not a lengthy diary of the Soviet trip. Yes, I did. And we left Moscow. I mean, we were right on Red Square. And so all of the parades and funerals would go by our window. It was the most amazing view all the time. You had the best seats imaginable, seeing what was going on in those days. But the day that we were scheduled to leave was the 25th of August, and it was the day that the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia, and the tanks were rolling through Red Square, and we were sure that there was going to be a great war. And we were lucky enough to fly out to London. And when we got to London, I called my mother in Mobile and said, "We're safe, we're fine." And she didn't know what was going on in Mobile, of course. They had no clue that there was any problem in the Soviet Union. But we were safe.
That's a fantastic story. I'm glad you kept a diary, so one day we can put it all together, right?
Right.
Did you also take photographs?
I think you've got many hundreds of
Absolutely.
photographs in the collection here. And I think that my son Dana and his wife Kathy Michaelis may have 1,000 slides of some of the different journeys.
Well, getting a little closer to home, I see in the collection a lot of photographs and scripts about Martin Luther King Jr. Were you involved in that?
I am so sad to say that I was not on that trip because I had just had I had young children, and so I didn't fly to Atlanta. And the great part of that interview is that Arnold was the only journalist to go into Dr. King's home to interview him, and Coretta as well, and talk with the children.
You're right, that is the most amazing thing. And I just wondered how he set that up. Did he know Martin Luther King Jr.?
I
from
think
the
it was his
past?
different connections because of Adlai Stevenson, who was the ambassador to the United Nations when John Kennedy was president. Between Ambassador Stevenson and Eleanor Roosevelt, I think his pathway really opened. Dr. King was interested in talking with him. He approached him directly.
That's fantastic.
And I think their letters back and forth inviting him to come and have the conversation.
Well, you, of course, with Arnold, you made many friends around the world, had many exciting times. But you yourself had some famous friends.
Absolutely. I say my life is made up of, well, it's beginning in Mobile, and then there was the musical period with all the great musicians, because after the Bruno Volta period, and after he left Columbia Records, he did television films for Channel 5, which is, oh God, what is it? Rupert Murdoch's, well, the Channel 5 is New York, WNEW, that's still New York, but it's a national, Fox, it's now Fox, that's what I'm getting to. Anyhow, he did a film about Bruno Volta, and we went to Vienna and photographed all of the places where he conducted with the background voiceover of his conversation with Bruno Volta. So we visited all of the bars and the houses in the country and the Staatsoper and places where he conducted. It's a beautiful film, and Salzburg as well. So that was another television film, as well as the Nehru and Indira Gandhi. Those were all television films. So it was all good. But that was my Arnold period. And then while I was still married, I called my psychoanalytic period, because so many of our friends were psychoanalysts, and they were an interesting, rare group. Strange, rather, but fun. And then, let's see, what period after that? Well, Arnold and I split, actually. He never really wanted me to leave him, and he never remarried, and I can say that, you know, as a woman, that's always a nice thing, not to have the man that you did love still love you. It's difficult, but it's nice. So I went into my public relations period, and I didn't ever have any journalism background or study communication or any of that, because I was a singer and an actress. So when I got a job working for a well-known dress designer named Arnold Scazi, who dressed the two Mrs. Bushes when they were in the White House, and many celebrities from Barbra Streisand to Diane Carroll and everybody you can think of. I worked for him, and I played the role of a PR person. That was how I got the job. I happened to know all of the people that were his clients, so I worked my way into that. And then when that was over, I got a PR job with a friend who had worked for Scazi, but he sort of dumped her, but kept me on for some crazy reason. And when my stint, which was a freelance stint with Scazi, was over, she asked me to go into business, so we had our own PR agency, which really, looking back, is a joke. But we did it for a while, and then she was going through a divorce, and she left me with the few clients we had, and then upped and got a job at an agency and called me and said, "You really should come work here with Jody Donahue, who is the top fashion PR house in the city." So I went and interviewed, and she hired me, and after about 6 weeks, she sacked Lucy and kept me, and I stayed there a dozen years. And over that time, I traveled and worked with Bob Mackie and Gloria Vanderbilt and Trigger and Charlotte Ford, and we introduced everybody from Yohji Yamamoto to this country, Escada, Givenchy. Not that we introduced Givenchy, but I worked with Monsieur Givenchy. And really, that was my wonderful PR period. And I've stayed friends with Gloria Vanderbilt and Charlotte Ford, and to this day, which is really lovely because I'm fond of both those ladies.
Well, that's fascinating, and I think maybe the last time I saw you, you were about to go to New York to be with Gloria Vanderbilt when her book and the documentary came out.
Yes, the film that she did with Anderson, that was an HBO film recently. She invited me to the premiere, it's a fabulous film. It really is. And the book that followed really extended their conversation in the film. It's gotten great reviews. It was on the bestseller list.
Another time I saw you in New York at the Peabody Awards.
Oh, absolutely,
Remember when
yes.
you brought your darling little granddaughter, and she was maybe 10 or 11 years old, and she was already in the entertainment business.
That's right. She and her mother and daddy, Lisa and Billy, Lisa Michaelis and Billy, her husband, Billy Schlosser, and Emily were called Laughing Pizza. And they won many awards for their band that was for families and children. And they won PBS every day playing their music, which they wrote and produced. And played the White House twice for the Easter egg roll. So she's grown up to be a songwriter in Nashville.
So definitely music has played an important part in your life.
For sure, yes.
You've had such an interesting life. When you look back, what are some of the high points for you?
Well, I think all of the trips during the, doing the conversations and doing the films were just remarkable. Being guests of Prime Minister Archbishop, actually. He was Prime Minister and Archbishop of Cyprus, and Archbishop of the Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. And we were his guests. And I had my children along as well. And the way we got to him is the ambassador from Cyprus to the United Nations was on the Adlai Stevenson reports, which Arnold was on camera with the governor or the ambassador. And so we became friends with Zenon and Torres Rosidis. So there were many trips, and Greece was another country where he interviewed the prime minister and made films. So it went on, which is a wonderful thing to look back on.
So when you look back at your career in New York and as a singer, and you see your granddaughter, and she's in show business, as it were, I guess you feel a continuum.
Yes, I do. It's fascinating from this vantage point to look back, and I'd love to do it all over again.
I bet you wouldn't change very much.
Some things, maybe. I'd write that book, which I never did do.
Well, it's not too late for that.
Well, it takes discipline.
Well, I think you have a lot of discipline and a lot of energy. Are there some things that we should talk about that I haven't thought to ask you?
I'll have to think a minute.
Think about, for the record, if you'd like to add anything.
Oh, there's so many interesting stories. Honestly, I can't believe I told you the hospital story and all its gore.
Well, it's good for us to know
that. Because there's
so
many other stories. I mean, even connected with the PR period. Mm-hmm. We were the agency that brought Simon and Garfunkel together with the first concert in the park.
Wow.
We did that, followed by James Taylor's concert in the park and Elton John. That was all great fun.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
Well, Marianne, if I may,
please.
I'd like to ask you maybe if you talk a little bit more about growing up as a singer and learning to sing and sort of your development of that, because it's quite a thing to sort of go from one thing, from having a talent to actually sort of going to being a professional, and particularly in this period in New York where really rich time, informative period. What was that like for you, and can you tell us more about sort of like how you decided to choose that path, and what went along with that?
Oh God. Huh. What was it like in that period of time?
Yeah, as a making that step from being from Mobile, Alabama, into I mean, it's difficult. That's not an easy path for.
But I think I kind of explained the fact that I was accustomed to the music and theater world,
right.
Even in Mobile,
right.
Because my mother was always involved in the music world, and she was on the board of Civic Music, which sponsored all of the famous musicians to come to Mobile to perform, so that even as a child, she would entertain them at home, at our house. And I remember falling in love probably I was 5 or 6, with Misha Elman's pianist, his accompanist. I thought he was the most handsome man I'd ever seen. And he sent me his picture. I really was obviously precocious, but I don't know, I guess I was just accustomed to being around musicians and people in the theater. And I acted as a child in Mobile in the theater. And being around my mother, who performed in Mobile, because my father wasn't going to let her go off and do other things either. So in New York, I was there by myself, but my mother called out every friend she'd ever met, I guess, told them to look after me, so that I was looked after. And I had a sort of wonderful experience, really. I was thrown into all kinds of things, even had a date with Cy Coleman when he was a pianist at the Sherry Netherlands bar, and no one knew who Cy Coleman was. And he was there, and the man who ran the bar was Count Obolensky, who was the designer who made Jackie Kennedy's hats. Oh, God. Anyhow, they were brothers. I don't know. I was just always with theater people. And one of the first off-Broadway shows that I did was the Children's World Theater, where we did Jack and the Beanstalk, and Tom Poston was the giant, and Conrad Bain was the farmer who gave Jack the beans. And it was produced by Joanne Bliss, who played the first Eileen and my sister Eileen on Broadway, and she married a very well-to-do man, and they produced the show. It was all photographed by Vogue, of all things. But it was fun. I played the harp that sang, magic harp, the golden harp. I'm not calling myself a harpy, but it was a golden harp.
What was your favorite role or piece that you sang or production you were a part of?
Oh, I know what I adored. I loved all of the Rodgers and Hammerstein and Jerome Kern things. And going to the recording sessions with Oscar Hammerstein and Dick Rodgers, I think just was divine, absolutely fabulous. And because they were my, my idols. That music will live on forever and ever. It's so gorgeous. And my accompanist was Al Simon, who was Carly Simon's uncle, and one of the Simons of Simon and Schuster. And he asked me to audition a song that he had written the music for, and Alice Hammerstein, Oscar's daughter, had written the lyrics, and I auditioned it at MCA. This was after I was married, though. That was big, that I was able to do that, and also did some Christmas music on WQXR, and what else? Oh, some long-forgotten television shows. But I think the theater music was, and going to the theater, musical theater, and singing musical theater is probably my favorite. And Steve Allen, do you remember who Steve Allen was? He was he was a pianist, and he was also preceded Johnny Carson, I think, on the Tonight Show. And he accompanied me at one point, and so did Alan J. Lerner. And that music is too gorgeous for words. My Fair Lady and Camelot, etc. On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. Those are the songs that I love to sing.
I'd like to ask you another question about sort of being on interviews with Arnold.
Yes.
What was? Can you describe his temperament, or sort of how were those, like, so people get to see, an interview, but what was it like behind the scenes and before the shoot? How did he work with the crew? How did you work with the crew? How did
Well, just like you did today, testing the background, the lighting, the camera positions, what's in the background, flowers, the books, where the setup is. That's what I did. And, oh God, there's so many other periods that I could talk about. You'll have to sort of cue me.
Well, what was he like to work with? Was he?
He was a major force. He did a lot of research, and he had a gorgeous speaking voice, and he had been a director of radio programs. He was in the early member of the Directors Guild in radio, and worked at Columbia, ABC, and NBC in the days before I knew him. And he was a commanding personality, and he was comfortable with anyone and everyone.
Marianne, did you have any more questions?
Did that answer anything at all?
Yes, it did. Actually, I have another question too. I wanted to ask you about the psychoanalytic period.
Oh, that was social, but it was, he's dead and gone, so I can tell you this. There was a well-known psychoanalyst who, have you heard of REM sleep, R-E-M, so that you know that you're dreaming, and he was the founder of this, which was fascinating, but he also had a mad crush on me and stand on the corner of Madison Avenue and wait for me to walk my daughter to school and follow me, which I didn't really feel comfortable about at all, knowing his wife, etc., and I had no interest in him. I'm not naming names, but that was part of it. We had a bunch of friends, and we all had dinners around at each other's houses. And there was somebody, there are so many interesting people in my background, from Mary Wells Lawrence, who founded her own agency, Wells, Rich and Green, and she and I sat in the kindergarten with our children, and she would tell me about how she was having Emilio Pucci design the stewardesses' their uniforms for, let's see, what was the Texas? She married him. What was the name of the airline?
Braniff Airline?
Braniff. Was it? It was Braniff, and they painted all of the planes, and she and her mother had rented space in one of the hotels, the Gotham Hotel at that time. So that was all fascinating, and our children were friends. And Anderson Cooper, who is so wonderful in today's news world, and his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, and my daughter and I would go out and take our children to the theater and to ballet and we went to the opera, but it was The Merry Widow. I think she and I enjoyed it a little bit more than they did, but we had good times together.
The last question I have, and it's maybe not so specific. I think I'd like to talk about, or I'd like you to talk about what maybe your experience with as far as being a woman and seeing issues of feminism or seeing a woman's role sort of changing sort of during this period. You're working with a lot of women, a lot of successful women, women who've had to make choices. You yourself made choices.
Yes.
Do you have any sort of observations or things that you would want to share with us?
It's certainly I saw huge changes from the time, my early days with Arnold Michaelis, and then the progress that I made as a woman on my own, because I then ended up working in an all agency, all women, and I became one of these officious people, I guess, and I came by it the hard way, where I got very directive. And I remember Jody and I and one other person got into a limo where we were going to a meeting, and we all said, "Now go." We all were going to tell them exactly what to do and where to go. And it was almost in unison. And I was never that way growing up. I never said no to Arnold. And then all of a sudden I was very directive and very controlling. So I had to later on back away from that, because you don't want to go from here to here. You really should mess with Mr. In Between. In between Arnold, I was involved with a man named John Philip Sousa III, who was the grandson of the March King. And that went on for 10 years or so. And it was great fun to be with John. He was not musical at all. His grandfather was the only musician in that whole big family. He was at one time publisher of Fortune magazine and had worked early days with Henry Luce at Time. And I met him really toward the end of his life, because he died when I left New York to go marry someone else. And back to Mobile at that.
Well, I think when you think about yourself as a young girl in Mobile, and you knew New York as a second home, really.
It seems like it's my home more than Mobile, though.
So for you to just up and go, I guess you went to high school, and
In
when you
Mobile.
graduated, you were on the next train.
I actually went to a church school. I wanted to go to Sarah Lawrence, and my father sent me off to the strictest church school, college in St. Louis, outside of St. Louis, on the bluffs of the Mississippi. I couldn't wait to get out of there. I felt I was in prison. So I left after a year and went. My mother let me go because that was what she would have done had she not married at 17. Mm-hmm. And so I got to be set up in an apartment in New York to do what I wanted to do and follow my bliss. I then got involved I moved after my last husband died suddenly. I was a gypsy, leaving Mobile every chance I could get because I hated being there without him. I went back to Mobile. Everybody knew me. I sort of knew who they were, but didn't remember their names. But when my husband, whose name was Edwin, but I called him Boots, when he was next to me, he would say, "That's Gertrude," or "That's Jane." And so but then I ended up like Ava Gabor, who I also traveled with, and so now I call everyone darling. Just like Ava, there's a method in that madness. I, of course, at that point was unaware of segregation or non-segregation because that's where I was born. And I remember as a child seeing the water fountains that said white and colored, and the black people stepping off the curb to let white people go by on downtown streets of Mobile. And I didn't think anything of it. When I think about it now, it tears at my heart, truly. I can't stand the thought of what those people went through, and I totally, I just relate to them so, and what they've come out of and still fighting for, truly. And I was brought up in a very privileged household with 5 in help around the clock and others that came in. It was a maternal, matriarchal society because my mother and father lived in my grandmother's house, and that's where I grew up. And then my mother had a brother, and his wife was my father's sister, so their children were my double first cousins. And that man, my uncle, also lived with his mother-in-law. So that was the way of the South at that point. And I remember going to I went to a public school. There were no private schools except the parochial schools. And I went to school around the corner, and the children were all white, but many very poor, and would come to school barefooted even. But as I got away from Mobile, the whole period changed, and the civil rights story began. That's when Arnold talked with Dr. King. And this was a very, very moving and meaningful period. But I was in New York, but being in Mobile and going home back to that same kind of feeling before segregation, because I moved to New York way before segregation. And showing my age, but that's the way it is. And
desegregation.
Desegregation, God help me, please. I was
school?
saying the way I was brought up. As a child, my grandmother took me and her daughter, my mother, and her sister, and we went off to the grand tour in Europe and went on a grand ship and docked in Holland, and were met by a car and driver and someone to take care of us in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Brussels, Paris, London. And it was really the grand tour. So I don't know, that was my introduction to fashion, because my mother took me with her to a couture, Schiaparelli. I remember the models walking around, and I wanted my mother to buy them all. She didn't buy any, but I wanted her to have them all. But later, I was telling you about the junior high school, I was sent to the school in a chauffeur-driven car, and I was very embarrassed by that. And I would hide on the floor and try to sneak out of the car, because I would get a lot of, calls. I don't remember what was said, but people were aware, because most people didn't have that. But I had a friend that I grew up with, and she was of the same kind of background, and we sort of stuck together. But today, well, my mother, up until the time she died, which was when she was 92, had help around the clock, and one man that lived, as we said in the South, on the place. He had his own apartment, so to speak, in the basement of the house. And I was very close to him and took care of him until he died, and I called him my brother, and he called me his sister. And when he died, and I had the program from the church from his funeral, it listed me as his stepsister, which really makes me cry. So sweet. But I talked to George and took care of him until the end, and I miss him. And he was kind of the only link to that period, and we would talk about it.
What were your observations when you went to New York with regard to race relations? Was what was different?
It was different because we had, I remember having black friends as they were musicians. And I remember one who, his name was Leon Bibb, gorgeous young man, had a marvelous singing voice. And I remember kissing him hello and goodbye. And that was very new for me. I thought it was great, but it was different. That was very early on.
And when you would go back to Mobile over the years, how did you see things changing between whites and blacks?
It was still very much there, but it was more desegregated. I mean, in the restaurants, office buildings, but yet I think the feeling exists in a way. But I think this generation is much better, and they know how to live with each other and don't think of it as much. Mobile had a lot of, but not problems like Selma, but there were lynchings, and I wasn't there at that time. And I wasn't as aware, as a young person, very young person, until later when I was living in New York, and then it washed over me of the horror.
So, to finish up, what are your plans now? So, you're very vibrant. What's on your to-do list?
I haven't done any work recently. I had been very involved with my Laughing Pizza children, but that has sort of come to a hiatus because I lost my daughter last November. And that's been the most difficult thing for me to deal with, because you don't ever want to lose a child. It's not good. It's terrible. So the last bit of public relations that I did as a freelance, but really out of love, I did the public relations for Gloria Vanderbilt's novella, which was an erotic novella called Obsession. And I did that and worked with her on that. But that's the last PR except for the Laughing Pizzas. I don't know what's in store for me, but I hope lots of wonderful, exciting things. I'm ready for it. For anything.
Well, it sounds like you've had many of those, and we wish you many more.
Thank you.